heard the tales of knights and kings, of grand battles and epic quests. But what about the stolen glances across feast halls? The letters never delivered. The lovers who met only in moonlight and never once spoke aloud. Welcome to medieval lore for sleep, where we leave the clamor of history's headlines behind and slip into the softer stories, the quiet romances, the rituals of affection, the almost forgotten moments that lived in castle corridors and candlelit corners. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a guided walk through the heart of a world where love had to be clever, patient, and sometimes painfully quiet. Because in the medieval world, affection didn't shout, it whispered. It baked extra bread. It folded someone's cloak with care. It placed flowers where only one person would know to look. And tonight, we're letting those whispers speak. Over the next chapters, you'll fall gently into tales of courtship, longing, and the soft, secret language of medieval love. Designed to relax your mind and quiet your thoughts, every story is told in a voice just above silence, perfect for rest, reflection, or simply drifting into dreams. So settle in, let the world fade, and allow yourself to be carried back in time, to the kind of love that doesn't make history books, but lingers softly in the dark. This is Lore FM, and tonight, the castle is waiting. Before we begin, let's make one thing very clear. Flirting in a medieval castle was less about charm and more about surviving the social Olympics. If you thought modern dating was awkward, try wooing someone while wearing 20 pounds of velvet, being watched by a dozen noble cousins, and knowing one wrong word might get you thrown in a moat. In the heart of a stone castle, nestled among grand tapestries and flickering torchlight, romance had rules. Not just any rules. Complicated, whispered about, etiquette manual and Latin kind of rules. You couldn't just stroll up to a lady and say she looked nice. You had to first be formally introduced, prove your nobility, and preferably have slain something recently. Bonus points if it had teeth. You see, in those times, marriage was mostly about alliances. Land, power, peace treaties. Love was more of an optional feature, like a decorative sword that nobody expected you to actually use. But that didn't stop people from secretly hoping for it. Behind every arranged engagement was someone secretly writing poetry by candlelight or sighing dramatically on a balcony. So if you were a young noble, maybe freshly knighted or freshly bored, you had to play it smart. There were looks, glances that lingered just a little too long across the feast table. You'd let your eyes drift casually over your goblet, pretending to admire the carving on the rim, when really you were trying to see if Lady Cicely looked your way. If she smiled, that was something. If she blushed, that was everything. If her older brother noticed, you were in trouble. Direct speech was rare. Everything had to be wrapped in layers of suggestion and courtesy. A compliment might sound like, "My lady, the way you walk rivals the grace of the swan that glides upon our Lord's lake," which is courtly language for, "Nice walk." She might reply with a modest smile and something like, "You honor me, good sir, though surely the swan deserves more credit than I translation. I know you're looking. So is everyone else." There were also tokens, small gestures to suggest interest. A dropped handkerchief, a favor given at a tournament, a flower placed carefully where it might be noticed, but not too noticed. The goal was always the same, make the other person curious, but never too sure. And if you were lucky enough to be in a court with music, things got even more theatrical. You'd hire a bard, yes, an actual bard, to sing a romantic ballad across the great hall. Not naming names, of course. Just a subtle song about unrequited love between two souls trapped by fate. Everyone would pretend not to know who the song was about. But they all knew. Castles were not exactly known for their privacy. This kind of slow burn romance had its risks. If you were too forward, people talked. If you weren't forward enough, they still talked. And if your crush was betrothed to someone else, which, let's be honest, they usually were, you better hope you liked pining. Because you'd be doing a lot of it. Still, for all its weirdness, this system worked. Sort of. It created a kind of dreamy tension that lasted for weeks, sometimes years. It turned every glance into a thrill, every encounter into a small, polite crisis. It made love feel like something rare, even sacred, partly because it was so hard to express. So here you are, in the echoing halls of stone and song, where love is a puzzle box wrapped in poetry and protocol. You're learning to read gestures like verses, to hear affection in footsteps, to spot flirtation between the lines of a dinner toast. Welcome to the castle of courtship, where love is whispered, never shouted, and absolutely nobody is making the first move without at least 3 witnesses and a witness's chaperone. The Great Hall was where everything happened: meals, announcements, awkward dancing, and, of course, medieval flirting disguised as intense glances between bites of mutton. In a world without texting, I contacted all the heavy lifting. Imagine this: you're seated at the long feast table, halfway down the line, somewhere between the roasted pheasant and a distant cousin you've never spoken to. Across the hall, lit by flickering torches and the glint of polished armor, sits someone devastatingly attractive. Maybe they're a baron's daughter, maybe they're someone else's promised spouse, maybe they're just really good at not slouching. Whatever it is, you feel something stir, possibly your heart, possibly indigestion. You don't say anything, of course. That would be wildly inappropriate. What you do is gaze. Briefly. Strategically. Not too long, just long enough to signal, hello. I am emotionally available and wash my face today. You look away quickly. Wait. Then glance back. If they're looking too, that's a spark. If they're laughing with someone else, that's a lesson. In medieval castles, romantic tension was thick enough to spread on bread. Every glance was observed by at least 5 other people, each of whom had opinions and access to gossip channels more efficient than modern social media. Servants whispered. Courtiers speculated. Entire reputations were shaped by whether you lingered a half-second too long on someone's forehead. But there was a rhythm to it, a kind of polite ritual. You'd exchange a few glances over several evenings, never in daylight, never during prayer. If the interest was mutual, it might escalate to a nod. A nod. That was basically a proposal. Don't overdo it. Now, for those of noble blood, there were additional challenges. Rank mattered. You couldn't just fall for someone whose family only owned one tower. That would be scandalous. You needed to assess, subtly, of course, their lineage, their dowry situation, and whether they were likely to have strong heirs or just a lot of opinions. Of course, these rules didn't apply the same way to those in the lower ranks of the castle. Servants had their own networks, their own rules, and significantly more access to candlelit corners. They too exchanged looks, notes, and the occasional comment passed over steaming trenchers. But for nobles, it was all glances, sighs, and maybe, just maybe, a comment about how lovely the weather had been that afternoon. Sometimes, you'd get bold. You might walk near them on purpose. Not talk, of course. Just walk. Slowly. Elegantly. With all the focus of someone pretending not to be interested while hoping to be noticed. And when they looked up, you casually observe a tapestry. The one with the dragons. Yes, that one. This strange, beautiful ritual continued endlessly. Nothing rushed, nothing confirmed. Just possibility floating in the candlelight. And the tension, it wasn't unpleasant. It was warm. Like a secret fire in a cold stone world. Everyone was pretending not to notice it. But they noticed, and so did you. And if you were truly daring, you might arrange to stand near them during a psalm. Not close enough to touch, heavens, no, but close enough that you could hear each other's breathing. That was intimate. That was practically scandalous. The whole process sounds silly now, doesn't it? But there was something magical in its slowness. Something strangely comforting about letting emotions brew over time like a good broth. There were no fast confessions, no rushed declarations. Just the art of being seen. And seen again. And then disappearing into the shadows, heart racing, with nothing more exchanged than a smile shared across a room full of witnesses. And really, wasn't that enough? By now, you've exchanged glances. You've shared a lingering gaze or two across the feast table, perhaps even stood near each other during a loop performance while pretending to admire the ceiling. Things are progressing. Very slowly. As is tradition. But don't get too comfortable. Enter the medieval chaperone. Every castle had them. Older relatives, strict aunts, loyal nurses, and retired knights turned watchdogs. Their mission? To ensure absolutely nothing scandalous happened between unmarried people of noble rank. If you were young and unwed, you rarely breathed without someone making a note of it. If your blush lasted too long, someone was fetching a priest. The presence of a chaperone meant that courtship had to be clever. You might sneak a line of poetry into a borrowed book or hide a flower beneath a napkin at dinner. A compliment had to be disguised as a moral observation. Your virtue shines brighter than the morning sun really meant I think you're stunning, and I'd like to meet you behind the tapestry after Vespers. But beware, chaperones weren't just decoration. These were trained observers. Many had lived through their own romantic entanglements and now viewed everyone else's with suspicion. If you looked too smitten, they'd separate you at once. If you whispered too long, they'd interrupt to discuss embroidery or something deeply unromantic like pig breeding. Even casual conversations were supervised. If you spoke with someone you fancied, it would be in the company of 3 other people, a live parrot, and possibly a monk who hated joy. One wrong phrase in the entire court would be whispering about you by sundown. And yet, people found ways. Some lords and ladies communicated using fans or gloves, or by the way they folded their napkins. You might hear a phrase like, "The garden looks well this morning," which really meant I'll be near the West Tower at moonrise. Entire relationships blown beneath the noses of those determined to prevent them. Of course, this all assumed your feelings were returned. Sometimes, you were smitten with someone who had no idea, or worse, didn't care. In such cases, you could write a poem and leave it anonymously, hoping it was appreciated, or ignored, or not read aloud during supper and attributed to the wrong person, which happened a lot. Still, when it worked, it was unforgettable. The thrill of being noticed in return, the quiet excitement of knowing someone was thinking of you, the shared smile across a room. No grand declarations, no rushing, just moments strung together like pearls, simple, delicate, and beautiful. Eventually, if things progress well enough, your families might arrange a formal meeting. Or not. Sometimes, the entire flirtation lasted only through the summer feast season before the object of your affection married someone else with more land, fewer freckles, or a better claim to an estate. And yet, you cherished it, even if nothing came of it, because flirting in a castle wasn't just about outcome. It was about experience, the anticipation, the sweetness of maybe, the soft ache of hoping. So you'd retreat to your chambers at night, replaying each glance in your mind like a sacred memory. You'd fall asleep beneath heavy blankets, the stone walls cold, the wind howling beyond the towers. But inside, warmth, from a single shared moment, a brush of eyes, a smile, a secret. And if you were lucky, tomorrow would bring another. Let's imagine you've survived the glances, the chaperones, and the fainting spells brought on by seeing someone brush their sleeve against a tapestry. You're ready to take things to the next level in medieval courtship, the love note. A tender, poetic expression of feelings, written carefully, sealed with wax, and almost certainly read by at least 3 other people before reaching its destination. Now, before you grab your quill and start scribbling, there's a small problem. Most people couldn't write, and even fewer could write anything romantic. So if you were hopelessly enamored but tragically illiterate, your options were as follows: hire a scribe, bribe a literate cousin, or try to compose your feelings using only flowers and the occasional carved trinket. But let's say you were one of the lucky few who could put pen to parchment. What then? You'd start with a flattering greeting, preferably something dramatic. "No, dear Lady Joan." That's for receipts. You'd want the shining star of my sleepless nights, or to the flame that warms my spirit even when it's snowing in the courtyard. Something over the top enough to make even the sternest monk roll his eyes. The content of the letter was where things really got theatrical. You couldn't just write, "Hey, I like you." That was far too modern and sensible. Instead, you compare your beloved to celestial bodies, describe how your heart ached like a wounded knight, and possibly throw in some Latin if you wanted to sound especially serious. There were rules, too. You had to sound tortured but polite, desperate but noble. No promises of secret meetings just yet, those came later. This first letter was simply to declare interest. A whisper on paper, a sigh pressed into ink. Of course, writing was only half the battle. Getting the letter delivered was an entirely different operation. You couldn't just hand it over. That would be scandalous. You had to find a messenger, often a loyal servant, a squire, or a bard who owed you a favor. They had to be discreet, loyal, and ideally not prone to gossip after too much cider. And once it was sent, the waiting began. Hours, days, sometimes weeks, during which you stared longingly out castle windows, composed dramatic songs in your head, and imagined at least 20 different reasons why you hadn't received a reply. Maybe they were offended. Maybe the letter was intercepted. Maybe it fell into a moat. Maybe they read it and fainted from sheer emotional overload. All possible, all probable, depending on your mood. Eventually, with a bit of luck and favorable winds, a reply might arrive. A small scroll, folded and sealed. You'd open it slowly, hands trembling, praying it wasn't just a polite rejection in verse. But if it wasn't, if it actually said something warm, a compliment, a clever line, maybe even a shared secret, well then, you are truly in the game now. One foot inside the castle of love. Now, let's say your letter landed beautifully. Your words impressed, your ink didn't smudge, and the recipient didn't mistake it for a shopping list. Congratulations. But you're still not done. Because nothing says I am truly and hopelessly besotted quite like hiring someone else to sing about it. Enter the bard. The medieval bard was part musician, part poet, and part castle gossip with a musical instrument. Armed with a lute, harp, or sometimes just a really committed singing voice, the bard could transform your shy feelings into a full-blown performance that echoed off the stone walls of the great hall. Now, hiring a bard to deliver your romantic message was equal parts sweet and risky. It was sweet because it turned your private affection into a lovely, poetic gesture. It was risky because, let's be honest, not every bard was subtle. Some leaned into the drama. Hard. They might begin their song with something like, "To the moonlit eyes of a noble rose whose beauty stirs even the coldest of chambers." Everyone in the room would freeze. People would start whispering. And your beloved, hopefully smiling, hopefully not sitting next to a jealous fiancé with a sword. In theory, you could request discretion. Something vague. Something gentle. But in practice, bards loved attention. They lived for the gasps, the sighs, the scandal. They might sing a romantic ballad so painfully specific that even the castle cook would know who it was about. Still, there was something undeniably charming about it all. As the lute played softly and the verses unfolded, the atmosphere would change. People would hush. Candles would flicker. Listeners would lean in, not just to hear the melody, but to witness a moment, real, tender, human. For a few minutes, love would hang in the air like perfume and poetry, and it didn't matter how silly or exaggerated the lyrics were. What mattered was the feeling. The act of putting your heart on display, even in a castle full of spectators and potential in-laws. Of course, if you weren't wealthy enough to hire a bard, or just preferred subtlety, you might sing the song yourself. Alone. Quietly. Beneath someone's window. That was another tradition, serenading. Standing below the balcony of the one you admired, strumming your instrument, trying to sound like someone who wasn't cold, nervous, or being stared at by passing guards. It was bold, brave, slightly foolish, but deeply romantic in its own medieval way. Did it always work? No. Sometimes the beloved didn't hear it. Sometimes they heard it and sent someone down with a broom. But once in a while, just once, they'd appear in the window, smile, and listen. And in that moment, you'd feel as though you'd been knighted by the stars themselves. Romance in castles wasn't just about clever words. It was about sound. Music, the echo of affection across stone corridors. Whether sung by a bard or hummed by a hopeful soul in a wool tunic, love had a soundtrack. And every note, every lyric, every shy verse carried the same message. I see you. I adore you. And I have no idea if this will work, but isn't it worth the song? You've written the letter. You've sent the psalm. You've poured your feelings into paper, parchment, and poetry. Now, you wait. And in a medieval castle, waiting felt like an eternity wrapped in stone and silence. There were no instant replies, no blinking dots to let you know someone was reading your declaration of love. There was just time. Long stretches of time. Filled with hope, doubt, and more than a little overthinking. Some people passed the time by composing more letters, drafts of drafts that would never be sent. Others paced, stared at doors, listened for footsteps, or consulted the castle's most powerful force, the gossip chain. Because even if your beloved hadn't replied yet, someone else might know something. A servant who heard a sigh, a squire who saw a smile, a nursemaid who noticed that your letter hadn't been burned. Small clues, nothing official, just enough to drive you wonderfully, deliciously mad. Then, one day, a note appears. Folded, sealed, slightly smudged. Your heart pounds like a war drum. You stare at it, afraid to open it too quickly. What if it's not a reply at all? What if it's from your aunt, reminding you to stop leaning too close to the fireplace? But no, it's from them. The handwriting is delicate, careful. The words inside, maybe they're poetic. Maybe they're simple. Maybe they say, I think of you when I walk through the garden. Or, I heard your song, and it made me smile. just a few lines, but they carry the weight of the moon. Or maybe it's a polite rejection. I am honored by your affection, but my heart lies elsewhere. I must focus on my duties to my family. Please stop sending bards. My father is beginning to ask questions. It happens, and when it does, you nod solemnly. You thank the messenger. You stare out the window with the tortured grace of someone who understands the cruel poetry of unrequited feelings. Then, you go find a snack, because even heartbreak can't compete with fresh bread and cheese. But let's say it's a yes, or a maybe, or a hesitant, delicate yes in progress. That's when everything shifts. Suddenly, the air in the great hall feels warmer. Every encounter carries possibility. When you pass each other, there's a new electricity in the silence. Conversations start to include tiny, personal phrases. I like the song. You write beautifully. I look forward to tomorrow. You're not officially courting, not yet. But something has begun. A quiet thread now runs between you, invisible to most, yet completely undeniable. And through all this, you keep the note, tucked safely beneath your pillow or behind your belt. You read it again and again, as if the words might change, as if the ink might rearrange itself into something even sweeter. But the truth is, it's already perfect. Because in a world where words were precious and feelings rarely spoken aloud, even the smallest reply meant everything. Now that feelings have been exchanged, slowly, poetically, and under the watchful eyes of half the castle, it's time for the next major event in medieval courtship, the dance. Not the kind of dance you might imagine with spinning, dipping, and dramatic flourishes. No, medieval dancing was a tightly controlled social ritual where the main goal was to look elegant while making absolutely sure your hands didn't linger too long on anyone else's sleeve. Flirting without touching. Intimacy without closeness. It was, in short, a masterpiece of restraint. Picture it, a grand hall glowing with candlelight, the scent of herbs scattered across the floor to mask the less than romantic smells of winter boots and boiled cabbage. Musicians in one corner pluck gently at lutes and fiddles. Courtiers stand in rows like chess pieces, each waiting their turn in a slow-moving pageant of pride, posture, and perfectly timed glances. If you were lucky enough to be paired with the one you admired, you'd have to keep a steady expression, polite, reserved, just interested enough to be noticed but not so obvious that anyone would have cause to comment. You'd hold out your hand, fingertips barely touching theirs. Just a brush. Just enough to make your pulse race without alerting the chaperones posted like gargoyles in every shadowed doorway. The dances were usually line-based or circular, everyone moving together in gentle, patterned steps. They weren't designed for chaos. They were designed to keep people in formation, in their place, and in their social rank. And yet, within that strict structure, there was room for magic. Every step was a chance. A moment to stand near, to smile, to speak softly between turns. The movements were repetitive, almost meditative, which left space for the imagination to wander. What did that smile mean? Was that accidental hand touch truly accidental? Were they moving slightly closer, or were you simply hoping they were? Sometimes, the most meaningful part of the dance happened in silence, when your partner turned their face just slightly toward you during a spin, or their sleeve brushed yours during a change of position. These were the sparks. Tiny and thrilling. Gone in a second, but powerful enough to fuel dreams for a week. Of course, not all dancers were graceful. Some tripped. Some froze. Some simply had no rhythm and stepped on other people's shoes while apologizing far too loudly. But even this could be endearing. Especially if your partner laughed, not cruelly, but warmly, acknowledging the shared awkwardness of trying to look regal while trying not to fall. And that was the thing about dancing in a castle. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about participating, showing up, risking a little vulnerability. For just a few minutes, everyone, noble or not, was part of the same story. A gentle, swaying story told with footsteps and fiddles and candlelit sighs. And if, by the end of the dance, you managed to lock eyes with your partner just once, with no one else looking, and they smiled, then you knew the evening had been worth it. Even if you spent most of it trying not to step on anyone's cloak. It's easy to think of dancing as something lighthearted, a pastime, a distraction from the seriousness of medieval life. But within castle walls, dances were far more than twirling entertainment. They were quiet battlegrounds of emotion. A place where longing was measured not in words, but in steps. The courtly dance was an opportunity, an excuse, a socially acceptable reason to be near someone you weren't supposed to be thinking about so often. It allowed two people to exist within the same space, close but not too close, connected but still under the rules. There were rules, of course. So many rules. You couldn't choose your own partner, not openly. Pairings were often arranged in advance, sometimes drawn by social rank, and sometimes suggested by a well-meaning elder who had no idea you were already writing poetry for the person 2 seats down. Even if you were lucky enough to be paired with your interest, you couldn't celebrate. You had to act as though this was all routine. Just another dance. Just another evening in the endless rhythm of noble life. The movements were deliberately slow and repetitive. Step, turn, bow. Step, turn, bow. The repetition was intentional. It allowed people to observe one another, to communicate with the subtlety of posture. A slight delay in a turn might mean nervousness. A deeper bow might mean respect. A held gaze might mean, well, everything. And yet, through all this formality, feelings bloomed. You learned someone's rhythm, their timing, whether they were graceful or clumsy, shy or bold, all without exchanging a single word. And as the music rose and fell, so did the quiet hopes of those who danced, hoping that their small efforts would be noticed, that their presence meant something more than just another partner in the pattern. Clothing played a part, too. Cloaks swirled, sleeves brushed. The fabrics themselves seemed to flirt. The rustle of silk, the shimmer of a brooch, the flick of a hem across stone floors, it all added to the spell of the moment. And if someone wore your favor, a ribbon, a token, a single stitch of your color, it could feel like a secret only the two of you shared. But the magic wasn't always mutual. There were times when one person danced with their heart in their throat, while the other simply counted steps and waited for the next tune. Times when someone reached with their spirit, only to be met with polite indifference. These dances hurt, even if no one could see it. Still, you danced. Because sometimes the next song did bring a smile, a glance, a whispered comment that left you wide awake for hours afterward. Sometimes, everything changed with a single shared moment between verses. When the music finally faded, and the musicians lowered their bows and plucked their final strings, you'd step back, bow once more, and part ways. Just like that. No hand-holding, no lingering farewells. Just a quiet goodbye beneath the gaze of the chord. And yet your heart would be full, or broken, or both. Because in the courtly dance of medieval castles, every emotion had to be folded carefully into ritual. And if you were lucky, your feelings would land in rhythm, just long enough to be returned. As the final notes of the evening drifted into silence, the last dance came to an end, not with a cheer, but with a soft bow, a courteous smile, and the slow reshuffling of nobles returning to their candlelit corners. The great hall, once full of movement and murmured hopes, returned to its usual rhythm, the clinking of goblets, the low hum of conversation, and the occasional bark from someone who drank too quickly. But for those who danced, the night didn't end there. Because the real magic of courtship in a castle began after the music stopped. You see, even though the dancing had rules, restrictions, partners, steps, what happened afterward was often far more telling. The way someone glanced at you across the room, now that they weren't required to. The way their gaze lingered a bit longer while servants cleared away the platters of roasted fowl and wilted greens. The subtle, careful ways affection found a way to linger in the air, even as the music faded. Maybe they passed you a folded note. Maybe they didn't. Maybe you caught them smiling when they thought no one was watching. Or maybe you smiled first. There were no grand kisses beneath banners or dramatic declarations at the foot of the throne. That kind of behavior was saved for the songs, not the reality. Real medieval romance was quieter, slower, steeped in formality and fear, but not without warmth. Even the servants noticed. They were the quiet observers, the keepers of moments. The ones who knew which lords adjusted their hair when certain ladies walked by. Which young ladies asked to dance with the same knight more than once. Which knight checked the hall twice before leaving, just in case someone was still there. Sometimes, after a dance, you'd find yourself alone in a corridor, the torchlight dancing on the stone walls, your own heartbeat the only music left. You'd wonder what it all meant. If the steps shared between you were just steps, or something more. And once in a while, if fortune was feeling kind, you'd meet again, at the stairwell, at the garden gate, by the stables where the horses slept and the air was thick with hay and possibilities. No words were needed. Just a look. A soft moment in the hush of night. This was the rhythm of castle romance. A series of glances, gestures, and steps that slowly stitched two lives closer, moment by moment, dance by dance. It wasn't fast. It wasn't always fair. but it was real. And as you slipped into your chambers that night, the candles flickering low, the echo of music still in your ears, you'd replay it all in your mind. Not just the steps, but their steps. The way they turned, the way they smiled, the way they looked at you as if the entire court had disappeared and it was just the two of you in a world built of music and maybe. And just like that, your dreams were already waiting. Let us now turn our attention to the noblest of flirts, the crown-wearing champions of dramatic affection, the royals. Because when it came to love in a castle, kings, queens, and their long line of fidgety cousins did not always lead with grace or tact. Sometimes they led with ego, sometimes with poetry, and often with compliments so strange you'd need a scribe just to decode the intent. Now, royalty had an advantage when it came to romantic pursuits. They didn't need to be charming. They were already powerful, which, depending on the personality in question, could be either a blessing or a complete disaster. A king didn't have to say, "I admire your intellect." He could simply declare, "You now dine at my table," and expect sparks to fly. Whether or not they actually did was beside the point. But many royals still enjoyed the game of courtly affection. It wasn't enough to simply command attention, they wanted to earn it, or at least dress it up in poetry and half-meaningful metaphors. Thus was born the royal pickup line, a curious combination of wit, vanity, and just a pinch of danger. Take, for instance, the classic comparison to nature. A noble might say, "Your beauty humbles the roses that bloom in my private garden." A sweet enough compliment, until you realize they've just likened your face to a fragile plant that needs trimming. Another common one, when you walk into the hall, the sun forgets to shine. Which sounds romantic, unless you're a medieval farmer who knows that too little sun is terrible news. Then there were the dangerously specific metaphors. Your voice is finer than the bells of St. Alaric's Cathedral, or your hair flows like the river Arden after a spring thaw. Compliments like these often told you more about the speaker than the subject, especially when the object of affection had never been to the river Arden and suspected it was more muddy than majestic. These lines weren't always effective, of course. Many were met with a modest smile and a polite nod, both staples of royal survival. You couldn't just snort at a prince's metaphor, no matter how odd. That could be seen as an insult to the realm, or worse, to the realm's poetry. And when the compliment came from someone truly powerful, like a monarch or high-ranking duke, things got even trickier. Because whether or not you were interested, you had to pretend to be flattered. Turning down affection from someone with an army, a treasury, and a suspiciously sharp pen collection was a delicate task. Too cold, and you risked offense. Too warm, and you might find yourself accidentally engaged. To navigate this, the courtiers of the day developed an impressive skill, responding without saying anything. A well-practiced nod, a strategically timed glance at the tapestry, a vague compliment in return. "My lord, your wit is as sharp as your reputation," all tools in the verbal dance that kept dignity intact and reputations untouched. Of course, some royals had genuine charm. There were stories of queens who wrote their own poetry, kings who danced poorly but enthusiastically, and noble heirs who fell in love with musicians, falconers, or in one case, the baker's daughter who had no idea who he was. Romance, it turns out, had a way of slipping past the barriers of status, even if the resulting scandal made its way into every letter and lullaby in the kingdom. But back to the lines. The most amusing thing about royal flirting was how public it often was. A prince might declare his admiration across a hall full of nobles. A noblewoman might drop her glove in front of the entire court, daring her chosen companion to retrieve it. These weren't just private gestures, they were performances. Carefully designed, possibly rehearsed, always observed. And the political consequences. Oh, they were everywhere. A compliment too bold could be seen as a declaration. A dance too long might spark a rumor. A letter delivered at the wrong time could lead to negotiations between families, or worse, duels. And should the compliment be directed towards someone already promised to another house, that wasn't just flirting. That was war. In this way, the royal pickup line was more than a clumsy attempt at affection. It was a ripple across the surface of a very deep, very delicate pool. And every noble in the room watched to see where the ripple would go. Still, despite the risks, despite the rumors, despite the endless metaphors involving flowers and celestial bodies, royal flirting remained a constant part of castle life. Because at the end of the day, even kings wanted to be noticed. Even queens hoped their smile meant something. Even nobles, weighed down by titles and duties, sometimes just wanted to feel the thrill of being admired, not for power, but for presence. And sometimes, against all odds, those ridiculous compliments actually worked. There's a special kind of tension that builds in a castle when two nobles start exchanging compliments that aren't technically romantic, but are also not technically innocent. Everyone notices. Everyone pretends not to notice. And everyone absolutely talks about it later, preferably over bread, wine, or while adjusting the tapestry for the third time that morning. These subtle exchanges were an art form. A nobleman might say, "Your insight during the steward's announcement was unexpectedly piercing," to which the lady might reply, "Only as piercing as your gaze across the hall." Was it flirtation? Was it mockery? Was it a political maneuver disguised as light banter? The answer, yes. Possibly all three. In medieval castles, there were rarely such things as private moments. Courting was a public sport. Every compliment was a chess move, every smile a signal. The words spoken were only half the story. What mattered just as much was who was listening. A compliment offered within earshot of a rival could spark weeks of social strategy, whispered rumors, and several rewritten ballads by the local bard. And so, castle flirtation took on layers. One compliment on someone's embroidery could mean, "I admire your taste," or it could mean, "Your needlework is finer than Lady Eleanor's, and I hope she heard that." A simple comment like, "This table seems more agreeable with your company," could be a genuine observation, or a way to see how the room reacted. Many nobles became skilled in the language of implication. Words like charming, elegant, and graceful were loaded with intent. Timing was everything. So was tone. Even a bow, if performed with just the right tilt, could imply affection, alliance, or audacious longing. It was the slowest game of romantic chess you've ever seen, and the stakes were often much higher than a broken heart. Sometimes these carefully crafted exchanges became so tangled that nobody knew what was happening anymore. Two nobles might spend weeks exchanging half compliments across banquets, dances, and church services, only to discover they were both flirting with the wrong person entirely. It happened, often, and was the source of more than one discreet giggle in the servants' quarters. Of course, some nobles didn't bother with subtlety. They preferred bold gestures, handwritten sonnets nailed to a beloved's chamber door, declarations made mid-feast, or serenades launched from atop castle walls at highly inappropriate hours. These were dramatic, passionate, and occasionally earned the singer a bucket of well water from a thoroughly unimpressed chambermaid. But for most, flirtation remained an exercise in restraint, because even a single compliment had consequences. A favor given too publicly might require a response. A glance returned too quickly might attract attention. The more visible the romance, the more eyes followed it. And in castles, eyes were everywhere. Still, these careful exchanges were not without reward. When done well, when the words were just ambiguous enough, the tone just warm enough, they could spark a kind of magic. A shared sense of secrecy, of something growing in plain sight that only the two of you fully understood. That's what made it exciting. You might cross paths in a quarter and exchange no more than a nod, but both of you knew exactly what that nod meant. You might sit across from each other at supper and pretend not to notice the way your shoes pointed slightly toward one another beneath the long table. You might speak only twice a day, and yet carry those words with you like heirlooms. And let us not forget the audience. The castle's wider population, from the kitchen staff to the guards, lived for these moments. They were the quiet spectators of every near scandal and noble near miss. They knew who had spoken to who had blushed at breakfast, and who had nearly dropped their goblet when someone unexpected walked into the hall. They were the invisible chroniclers of courtly affection, passing information more efficiently than royal messengers ever could. So while the words of affection may have been wrapped in velvet phrasing, their impact was real. A well-placed compliment could elevate reputations, forge alliances, or incite jealous whispers from rival suitors. And sometimes, on rare and beautiful occasions, it led to something deeper. A meeting of minds. A matching of hearts. A bond that lasted longer than the fashion of fur-lined sleeves or spiral-shaped braids. In castles, compliments were currency, and the truly skilled knew how to spend them wisely. There's something wonderfully ridiculous about the idea that a single compliment, spoken too boldly in the wrong quarter, could end with someone preparing for marriage. And yet, in the delicate world of castle courtship, this was not only possible, it was surprisingly common. Because in medieval noble society, words were weighty things. They didn't just float into the air like harmless puffs of charm. No, they sank. They lingered. They were written down, repeated, and used as evidence. One poetic flourish too many and you weren't just being sweet, you were making intentions known. and intentions in the court were serious business. Say, for instance, you told a lady, "I dreamed of your smile as I rode beneath the stars." Very romantic, very atmospheric. But depending on who heard it, and someone always did, that statement might be taken as a declaration of romantic pursuit, which meant her family would now be interested, which meant your family would be dragged into it, which meant you might be asked to explain yourself at a formal gathering in front of witnesses. Now, if both families liked the idea, congratulations, you were halfway to a betrothal. But if one side raised a brow, well, then your sweet little compliment had just sparked a diplomatic situation involving titles, dowries, land borders, and 3 very annoyed scribes. This is why so many castle dwellers became masters of the almost compliment, the safe flattery, the technically meaningless praise. A statement like, "Your presence brightens the hall more than the finest chandelier," sounds lovely, but no one can quite prove it meant anything. And yet, sometimes people still got it wrong. There's the famous tale of a young knight who complimented a noblewoman's embroidery so enthusiastically and so publicly that it was interpreted as a request to court her. By the next week, his mother was meeting with her aunt, trying to untangle the consequences of his loose tongue and deep admiration for floral patterns. But it wasn't all chaos. Sometimes these accidental entanglements turned into something real. 2 people pushed into awkward proximity by rumor and custom might eventually find they did enjoy each other's company. They might bond over shared embarrassment, over late-night walks arranged to smooth things over letters exchanged not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And in those rare moments, the court's madness gave way to something genuine. Still, for every love story that bloomed from a misplaced compliment, there were 3 others that collapsed under pressure. A noble might compliment a lady's singing voice, only to discover her father had already promised her to someone twice her age and 4 times as influential. Or a young lady might return a compliment with too much warmth, leading her family to believe she was plotting to marry beneath her station. In those cases, apologies had to be issued, clarifications made. Occasionally, someone would leave the court entirely for a long visit to relatives in the countryside, only to return once the scandal had cooled. No one spoke of it directly, of course. They simply referred to it as that little misunderstanding from the spring feast and moved on. Because in castles, even romance had to maintain its decorum. What made it all so fragile and so captivating was how little could be said openly. The danger of words meant that feelings had to find other ways to travel. Through glances, through gestures, through the spaces between sentences, through compliments that were technically meaningless, and yet meant everything. So when someone said, "You look well this evening," you listened closely. Did they say it differently than usual? Was their voice softer? Did they pause before turning away? And if they said nothing at all, but stood a little closer, or waited for you by the corridor longer than needed, that said even more. Flirting in a castle wasn't a game of speed. It was a slow, layered story told in whispers and silences, in dinners and dances and carefully chosen phrases that might, if you were lucky, lead to something more. Or, if you weren't, a wedding invitation you never expected. In theory, love in a castle was a carefully arranged affair, organized by noble families, guided by alliances, and secured with documents, dowries, and blessings from the nearest bishop. But in practice, it was often messy, improvised, dramatic, and very, very secret. Because for every noble couple who met at a feast and married with the approval of their families, there were 5 more whispering through doorways, exchanging glances across chapel pews, or writing letters they weren't supposed to write. These were the lovers who met at the wrong time, in the wrong place, and often with the wrong last names. In fact, one could argue that forbidden love was the default setting in most castles. Sometimes the obstacle was simple. One of them was already promised to someone else. Engagements were political arrangements, not personal choices. So even if 2 people had a connection, a spark that lit up a cold corridor, they often had no real say in what happened next. A noblewoman could find herself betrothed at 14 to a man she barely knew, while the boy she liked was sent off to serve as a page in another household. That was the way of things. Other times, the love was deemed inappropriate due to status. A knight falling for a noble's daughter. A lady in waiting enchanted by a visiting scholar. A prince enchanted by a falconer with kind eyes and calloused hands. These were the stories people whispered about behind tapestries, stories that seemed too romantic to be real, until, of course, they were. What made these affairs so thrilling and so dangerous was the risk. Every castle had its secrets, but love was the most difficult one to hide. There were always too many eyes, servants changing linens, guards walking the halls, advisors who noticed everything. A single misplaced letter or the wrong person exiting the wrong door at the wrong hour could unravel even the most carefully hidden courtship. And yet, people tried anyway. They arranged meetings in the gardens during twilight, where the fading light made it easier to blend into the hedges. They sent coded messages through poems and song lyrics. They met in the chapel under the pretense of prayer, each glance stolen behind a pillar or beneath the stained glass windows. And let's not forget the secret staircases. Every castle had them, those narrow, winding passageways used by servants and, more importantly, star-crossed lovers. They creaked. They echoed. They were poorly lit. But they offered the one thing that love in a castle almost never did: privacy. Of course, not every forbidden romance ended in disaster. Some endured. Some even triumphed. There are stories, quiet ones, of nobles who defied expectations and found ways to be together, despite the laws of lineage and inheritance. These were rare, hard-won victories, and often came at great cost. But they existed. And when those stories reached the ears of other hopeful hearts, they spread like sparks in the dry thatch of longing. It wasn't always noble hearts that tangled in forbidden love. Servants, scribes, and soldiers had their share of complications too. A kitchen maid and a stable hand. A guard and a visiting messenger. A seamstress and a scholar. Their romances may not have been written in official court records, but they lived on in whispered retellings and half-sung lullabies passed down through generations. Because whether you wore silk or homespun, love didn't ask for permission. Still, the risks were real. For nobles, a forbidden romance could lead to exile or disgrace. For servants, it could mean punishment or dismissal. And yet, they flirted. They hoped. They met in moonlight. Because sometimes, the feeling was worth the fallout. And in a place where everything was governed by duty and appearance, the idea of something real, something freely chosen, held a kind of magic. So when you hear the story of a noble who left behind wealth for love, or a lady who disappeared the night before her wedding, or a servant who vanished with a lock of their lover's hair wrapped in cloth, know this. That was not an unusual tale. That was a Tuesday. Because behind the thick stone walls, beyond the banquet halls and rigid traditions, love continued to find its way. Quietly, boldly, and often against all odds. It's strange how a single glance, one brief moment in a hallway, could mean everything in a place like a castle. Because when love had to stay hidden, the smallest gestures became lifelines. A lingering look could replace an entire conversation. A shared smile could hold more promise than any formal engagement contract ever could. But of course, love couldn't survive on glances alone. Words were needed, quiet, private, honest words, and that's where letters came in. In the world of forbidden romance, letters were precious. They were risky. They were dangerous. And they were written anyway. A secret love letter was not simply a note. It was a confession in ink, a tightly folded piece of defiance. It might be written on scrap parchment, tucked inside the pages of a prayer book, or hidden beneath the folds of a wool cloak. Often, it was delivered by someone who didn't even know what they were carrying, just a folded slip passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. The language of these letters was always coded. Names were rarely used. Instead, lovers used symbols, nicknames, and metaphors. The moon shines softer when you are near. The rose beneath the east tower still blooms. I long for the chapel bell where I once heard you breathe. The words had to be poetic, but not too obvious. Sincere, but never desperate. And they had to be written with the understanding that anyone might read them. A curious chambermaid. A jealous rival. A brother with poor impulse control and access to sharp weaponry. Still, the letters were written, often late at night, by candlelight, with trembling hands and racing thoughts. Some were never sent. Some were intercepted. A few were found years later, hidden in drawers and crevices, proof that even in the most rigid of courts, someone once loved someone they weren't supposed to. Along with letters came meeting places. These weren't grand, romantic locations like in the songs. No fields of flowers or moonlit balconies. No, these were the quiet places, the neglected corners of the castle where few dared to linger. The old stairwells behind the kitchens. The corridor near the storeroom where the tapestries didn't quite meet the wall. The stable loft where the scent of hay covered the scent of perfume. These were the places where hands touched briefly, where eyes met without interruption, where the rhythm of duty was paused, even just for a breath. These weren't dramatic moments. They were soft ones, muted and stolen. And then there were the locked doors. Some chambers were kept sealed not for safety or security, but for privacy. A door that could only be opened from the inside. A passage that only two people knew. These were the spaces where trust lived, and also where fear waited. Because a locked door might protect you today, but be your undoing tomorrow. All it took was one wrong person asking one wrong question. Still, lovers continued. They planned. They waited. Sometimes for hours. Sometimes for weeks. And in the waiting, they learned to cherish things others overlooked. The brush of cloth on cloth. The sound of footsteps that matched their own. The pause before a goodbye. Because when a touch couldn't linger and a kiss couldn't happen, all that remained was presence. Even silence became sacred. And when the time came to part, to return to their separate roles, their separate expectations, they did so with the quiet ache of those who knew how little time they had, and how deeply they valued every stolen second. Love, when forbidden, became a study in stillness, in restraint, in the art of saying everything without saying anything at all. And long after the doors closed, long after the candles were snuffed and the halls fell quiet, they would lie awake in their separate chambers, remembering how it felt to stand that close, and dream of the next time. By now, you know that forbidden love in a medieval castle wasn't rare, it was practically tradition. When everything else in your life was chosen for you, your clothes, your meals, your future, falling for someone off script felt like the only real decision you ever got to make. Even if it was risky. Even if it made no sense. Especially if it made no sense. Because love, when it broke the rules, carried a strange kind of clarity. It sharpened everything. The sound of a name whispered in the dark. The scrape of boots near the old stairs. The warmth of a borrowed scarf passed between hands pretending not to tremble. It was in these moments that people felt most awake, most alive. But not every story of forbidden love ended in quiet longing. Some ended in choices. There were those who dared to defy it all. A knight who fled his post to be with a healer he wasn't allowed to court. A lady who packed her things in silence and slipped out beneath the cover of night, choosing uncertainty over a life bound to someone she'd never cared for. They were rare, not because people lacked courage, but because consequences were real. Banishment, disgrace, poverty, in some cases, imprisonment. Loving the wrong person could cost you everything, and still, some said yes. Even those who stayed behind carried the weight of that choice. They lived out the lives that were arranged for them, dignified, noble, respectable. But there were always traces. A necklace never taken off. A song hummed quietly near the fire. A faraway look when a name was mentioned, one the family pretended not to recognize. Sometimes, the only proof that love had existed was how often it had to be hidden. But even unfulfilled, even interrupted, love left marks. On castle walls where fingers once traced initials. On garden stones where two people used to meet. In the old books where pressed flowers lay flattened between pages like a secret blooming in silence. And the castle remembered. It remembered the footfalls in the hallway at night. The faint scent of lavender that clung to a tapestry longer than anyone expected. The way two people once paused beside the same window, week after week, never speaking but always arriving just before dusk. The truth is, love in the medieval world wasn't simple, clean, or safe. But it was persistent. It existed in the margins of duty, in the corners of quarters, in the quiet rebellion of choosing to care even when everything said not to. And so, even as nobles pledged their futures at feasts and heirs were promised before they could walk, the whispers continued. About the ones who loved in secret. About the ones who dared. About the ones who lost, and the ones who didn't care if they did. Because even in the most rigid courts, where the rules were written in stone and names were spoken like currencies, there was always someone who looked at someone else and thought, yes, you, no matter what they say. And that thought, just that one, was enough to start a fire that even the coldest castle stones couldn't put out. When most people picture romance in medieval castles, they imagine candlelight, poetry, and dramatic glances exchanged across the great hall. But the truth is, love wasn't always wrapped in silk and serenades. Sometimes it came dressed in mud-stained boots, holding a turnip, and asking for a blessing to touch your glove. Welcome to the wonderfully odd world of medieval courtship rituals. Now, not every tradition was strange. Some were predictable, offering a flower, requesting a dance, writing a poem that compared someone to a dove that had just narrowly avoided being eaten by a falcon. All lovely gestures, all perfectly acceptable. But then there were the other traditions, the ones that made you wonder whether medieval people were romantic, or just a little bored. Take, for instance, the giving of gloves. In many courts, gifting someone a glove wasn't just practical, it was practically a love letter. A knight might present his lady with one of his own gloves before heading into battle. She would wear it tucked into her belt, near her heart, or sometimes even sew it into the lining of her gown. It was a sign of loyalty, affection, and very cold fingers. But if a lady gave a glove back to a knight, that could mean many things: encouragement, affection, or, depending on the court, permission to shout her name dramatically from horseback during a joust. Then there were tournaments. Yes, they were displays of chivalry and skill. But make no mistake, those lances weren't just for glory. They were for flirting. A knight might dedicate his performance to a lady, wearing her favor, usually a ribbon or scarf, somewhere on his armor. The brighter the ribbon, the bolder the gesture. Sometimes these favors were given in secret. Sometimes they were handed over in front of the entire court, which guaranteed at least 3 new rumors before the next meal. In quieter corners of courtship, food played a role too. Offering someone a fruit, especially an apple, could be a gentle invitation. Accepting it meant interest. Eating it on the spot, very bold. Sharing it, scandalously forward. And then there were riddles. Yes, riddles. Medieval sweethearts often exchanged poetic puzzles as a form of flirtation. A noble might send a coded verse full of layered metaphors, hoping their beloved could decipher the hidden meaning. Ideally, the answer was something romantic. But sometimes, it was just a test to see if the recipient could actually read. Literacy and longing often went hand in hand. Of course, there were missteps. One well-meaning knight once carved a love poem into a wooden plate and sent it to a noblewoman at supper. She misunderstood and thought he was offering her dining advice. The romance fizzled shortly after. But not all gestures were symbolic. Some were just practical. A man might offer to repair a lady's shoe or brush the mud from her cloak after a storm. And though it sounds simple, in a time when so many relationships were arranged, these small, voluntary acts of care held enormous meaning. And let's not forget public blessings. In some regions, when a couple began courting officially, they would appear before the local priest for a sort of pre-marriage acknowledgement. This didn't bind them, but it allowed for open visits and conversations in the presence of witnesses. It also meant their intentions were known, something that could either bring joy or start a feud, depending on who else had eyes for the same person. In noble circles, courtship wasn't always about the heart. It was about alliances. But every so often, even within the tight script of social duty, someone would surprise the court with a gesture that didn't make sense politically, but made perfect sense to the two people exchanging it. A mismatched ring. A song written without commission. A gift made by hand instead of commission from a craftsman. These small things, odd, sweet, strange, were the heartbeats beneath the formal rhythm of castle life. And even now, centuries later, the memory of those gestures lingers. Quiet tokens. Soft moments. Turnips, gloves, apples, and all. Because when you're not allowed to say what you feel, sometimes the best way to show it is by giving someone a riddle and hoping they solve it with a smile. The deeper you wander into medieval courtship, the clearer it becomes. People have always been deeply creative and occasionally ridiculous when trying to show affection. And in a world where direct words were discouraged and intentions had to be smuggled through rituals, the gift of a small, strange object could say more than a dozen carefully whispered compliments. These objects were called love tokens. They weren't grand or expensive. Quite the opposite, really. They were usually small, personal, and oddly specific. A ribbon from a sleeve. A carved bit of wood. A pressed flower from a garden no one else knew they visited. The point wasn't to impress. The point was to mean something. And one of the most common tokens, a goose feather. Yes, a feather. Light, ordinary, and often found scattered around castle courtyards like lost thoughts. But if you plucked one, cleaned it, and handed it to someone with a solemn look, it suddenly became a symbol of softness, of flight, of a future you were too afraid to describe aloud. Sometimes it was tied with thread. Sometimes it was placed inside a book of psalms. The recipient would know, or at least they would hope they knew. And if they kept it, That was a reply in itself. Then there were carved tokens. A knight might spend hours whittling a tiny emblem, something that represented his feelings. A heart, a flower, a star. He might not be a skilled artist. The edges might be uneven. But he'd tuck it into a pouch or tie it to a bit of cloth and send it along, hoping it would be cherished. Ladies, too, gave tokens. A lock of hair, a silk ribbon, a scent sachet, usually filled with dried lavender or rosemary, that could be tucked into armor or hung beside a bed. These were not grand gestures. They were private ones. Small bursts of affection in a world of large, loud obligations. And then, sometimes, there were edible gifts. It's true. Sharing food was another language entirely. A perfectly ripened apple, a honey cake wrapped in linen, even a roasted chestnut slipped into a hand during a stroll could carry a message. I was thinking of you. I saved this for you. I hope this warms you in the cold. Not all tokens were pretty. Some were downright strange. One well-documented story tells of a young woman who gifted her beloved a perfectly round turnip. Why? No one knows. But he kept it, dried it, actually, and wore it around his neck as a charm until it crumbled. To them, it meant something. And that's all that mattered. There were also painted stones, small notes etched with symbols, or fabric scraps embroidered with initials or tiny images. These weren't the kinds of gifts displayed publicly. They were hidden in drawers, under pillows, behind religious icons, carried during travel, held during prayers. Even the act of returning a token was its own ritual. If feelings faded, or if circumstances forced two lovers apart, the token was often given back. Not tossed aside, not broken, but placed gently into the giver's hand with a quiet look that said everything the world wouldn't let them say. And in some cases, tokens weren't given yet, they were left somewhere to be found. Imagine walking into the great hall and seeing your favorite flower tucked into your goblet, or discovering a folded square of parchment with a familiar pattern resting on your cloak. No words, just a feeling, just a moment. Tokens allowed lovers to communicate across distance, silence, and duty. They could be held in times of fear, remembered in moments of doubt, and treasured in years when nothing else remained. Because no matter how strange they were, no matter if they were feathers, ribbons, or yes, even vegetables, these little gifts were the language of hope, of defiance, of tenderness in a time when affection had to sneak through cracks in the castle walls. And in that way, a simple token became something sacred. If there was one thing a medieval noble was willing to invest serious time and effort into, aside from politics, fashion, and figuring out which cousin had insulted which lord, it was the act of wooing. Because in a world where most marriages were arranged, the act of earning someone's affection wasn't just daring. It was downright exhilarating, and sometimes wildly elaborate. Let's begin with the public displays. Tournaments were more than just shows of strength. They were romantic theater. A knight didn't just charge into a joust for glory, he charged for honor, often under the banner of the person he admired. He carried her token into the field, pinned to his armor or tied around his lance, and if he won the round, the entire crowd would know whom he fought for. No pressure, of course. And the lady, she would sit among the nobility, pretending not to beam with pride while at least 5 other women asked, "Is that your ribbon he's wearing?" Sometimes the wooing was far less violent and far more musical. Bards and minstrels were hired to compose custom songs, little melodic messages dressed up in metaphors. One nobleman once commissioned a song that compared his beloved to a hawk, a rose, the morning mist, and a very well-made saddle. Somehow, it worked. But wooing wasn't always grand. Sometimes it was repetitive, painfully repetitive. A noble might spend weeks, months, courting someone the proper way. This meant presenting himself daily, dressed in his best, offering small gifts, asking after their health, and complimenting their embroidery even if he didn't know what embroidery was. Each gesture had to be just bold enough to suggest interest, but never so bold as to imply expectation. Because expectation, in a courtship, was dangerous. It assumed too much. It signaled entitlement. And in court, entitlement could make even the sweetest poem feel like a business transaction. Now, if the recipient of all this affection was interested, they might respond with their own gestures. An invitation to walk in the garden, a shared glance at the feast table, a return token, a ribbon or piece of lace. If they were very bold, they might even lean slightly closer during conversation, allowing their sleeves to brush. That brush of fabric, practically a proposal. But not all wooing was welcome. And medieval etiquette books, yes, they existed, warned against pressing too hard. A noblewoman might tolerate a suitor's persistence out of politeness, but if he crossed the line, her family would step in. And when a family stepped in, it often came with a stern message, a forced apology, and a sudden invitation for the suitor to go visit relatives in the north. Wooing also had its seasonal rhythms. Winter, for instance, was a popular time for quiet courtship. The cold kept people indoors, and long evenings by the fire created opportunities for shared stories, small gifts, and just enough flickering candlelight to make someone's profile look especially poetic. Summer, on the other hand, was for bold moves. Picnics in the gardens, late-night music in the courtyard, dramatic declarations shouted from towers while someone's uncle yelled from a window to keep it down. In every season, wooing was about timing. About knowing when to speak, when to step back, when to send a message, and when to wait. It was about listening as much as talking. And always, it was about watching for signs. Because in a place where arranged marriages were inked on parchment long before the first smile was exchanged, real affection had to be grown in the quiet spaces. In between the formalities. Beneath the surface of expectations. And for those who dared to try, those who took the risk of making their affection known, the reward was never guaranteed. But sometimes, just sometimes, it worked. A dance turned into a conversation. A conversation turned into a letter. A letter turned into a walk. And a walk turned into something neither of them had ever expected. A love that was chosen, built, earned. And in that way, wooing in a medieval castle wasn't just about courtship. It was about hope. By now, we've wandered through secret glances, carved tokens, midnight letters, and dramatic jousts. But if there's one force in a medieval castle more powerful than romantic longing, it was the chaperone, the eternal guardian of virtue, reputation, and keeping two people from ever standing too close in a hallway. Let us paint the scene. You finally worked up the courage to approach your beloved. You've chosen the right words, maybe even practiced them in your chamber while pretending a pillow was a person. You round the corner of the great hall, and there she is, standing beside a table of pears and moral obligations. And standing directly behind her, her aunt, her ever-present, cloak-wrapped, suspicion-soaked aunt, the one who lives to intercept letters, who pretends to nap but hears everything, and who once ended a promising courtship by claiming a young man's compliment sounded too French. That's the kind of energy a chaperone brings to the room. They came in many forms. The vigilant aunt, the stern tutor, the nursemaid with an iron spine and a sixth sense for sneaking, and occasionally, the overzealous younger sibling with no filter and no understanding of privacy whatsoever. Their mission was simple: guard reputations, enforce the rules, ensure that no amount of moonlight, lute playing, or poetic sighing resulted in scandal. And if that meant following you like a shadow and interrupting every conversation with a cough, so be it. Now, not all chaperones were harsh. Some were quietly amused. They'd seen enough lovesick glances in their day to know when something was genuine. And once in a while, when the moon was right and the mood was soft, they might look the other way. Just for a moment. Just long enough for a hand to brush another in passing. A rare mercy. A silent gift. But most of the time, chaperones meant curfews. Boundaries. Entire seating arrangements built to ensure that no one's elbow got any funny ideas. And yet, lovers adapted. They developed systems. Signals. Entire methods of communication designed to function around the chaperone's gaze. A glance toward the doorway meant meet me after vespers. Adjusting a brooch meant the note is in the chapel. A dropped handkerchief wasn't just a mess, it was a message. The creativity required was impressive. One couple reportedly courted for 2 years while never speaking directly. Every message was passed through a servant, hidden in a folded cloth napkin, or disguised as an inventory list. The chaperone, none the wiser. At feasts, lovers sat diagonally across the table from one another, pretending to be entirely absorbed in roast duck while holding an entire silent conversation through eye contact. It was exhausting. It was awkward. It was thrilling. Sometimes, the chaperone would catch on. And then came the consequences. A change in schedules. A reassignment of seating. A very uncomfortable conversation involving phrases like respectability and your uncle's reputation is not a punchline. Still, lovers tried. Because in the strange geometry of castle romance, even a brief, guarded encounter could be meaningful. A walk down a corridor with 3 people present present. A ride to the market where someone else held the reins. A moment in the library, flipping through books neither of you were actually reading. These were the stolen seconds. The ones you'd remember more vividly than any formal introduction. And it wasn't just nobles who dealt with this. Servants, too, had their own versions. Curfews enforced by head cooks. Rotations designed to prevent fraternizing. Tasks reassigned when a glance lingered too long between the candle maker and the stable boy. But as always, affection found its way. Through smiles, through small favors, through whispered jokes behind linen sheets and quiet laughter in the kitchens after dark. The truth was, in a world full of rules, falling in love was already an act of rebellion. But staying in love, despite the chaperones, despite the curfews, despite the risk of it all, was a kind of bravery all its own. And for those who dared to try, even a moment together could feel like a triumph. While chaperones watched the halls and parents arrange futures, there was a quieter, more mysterious system humming just beneath the surface of castle life, the Whisper Network. The unofficial communication channel used by servants, squires, maids, musicians, and anyone else who had ears, eyes, and a fondness for soft chaos. Because let's be honest, if two people in a castle were secretly courting, everyone but the chaperone probably already knew. It usually began with something subtle. A passing glance that lingered just a moment too long. A tray of figs delivered to the wrong chamber 3 times in 1 week. A noble's sudden and repeated interest in practicing archery directly outside someone else's window. Small things, but noticed. And once someone noticed, the network activated. Quietly, efficiently, like a secret order of romantically invested observers. A kitchen maid might mention what she saw to a seamstress while folding linens. A stable boy might confirm it while brushing down a horse. The castle musician might spot something interesting during supper and report it to the laundress, who definitely told the candle maker. Within a day or two, the entire lower court would be aware that something was happening. Of course, they didn't always talk openly. That would be improper. Instead, they shared half smiles, raised eyebrows, a knowing hum when a certain name was mentioned. And if the lovers walked by together, someone would drop a spoon. On purpose. Now, the Whisper Network wasn't malicious. Quite the opposite, it was protective, supportive, intrigued. It wanted the romance to succeed, but it also wanted updates. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had a prediction. And if you didn't want your love story turning into the castle's next unofficial ballad, you had to move carefully. Still, sometimes the lovers leaned into it. Sometimes they left clues on purpose. A book passed from one to another. A scarf returned in public. A line recited from a poem that only 2 people truly understood. Because in the game of castle courtship, a little mystery kept things interesting. And occasionally, the Whisper Network helped. There were messengers who accidentally delivered notes to the correct wrong person. Maids who turned around at just the right moment. Guards who cleared corridors with suspiciously convenient timing. These weren't acts of disobedience, they were acts of romantic loyalty. And everyone involved felt just a little bit proud to play their part. But it was also risky. If the wrong person heard the wrong whisper, everything could unravel. A misplaced comment, a letter found, a joke told in the wrong company. Rumors traveled fast, and once the Whisper Network included nobility, the tone changed. Affection became scandal. Curiosity became consequence. So lovers had to be careful, thoughtful, patient. They learned to speak through silence, to trust the space between words, to rely on signals rather than speech. And they did so surrounded by a cast of uncredited co-stars, people who watched the floors, lit the candles, served the meals, and quietly carried the weight of their secrets. Because for every highborn romance sung about by bards, there were 10 others that lived in shadows, in glances passed during laundry, in notes hidden behind candles, in brief moments shared by the hearth while the world turned its head. These weren't grand, public love stories, but they were real. And in the quiet corners of castle life, real was rare, precious, worth protecting. So the Whisper Network did its work. And though no one spoke of it directly, everyone knew love was blooming again, and they would do what they could to help it grow. By now, you know how difficult it was to love out loud in a medieval castle. Between the chaperones, the rules, the Whisper Networks, and the 1,000 unspoken expectations, even thinking about someone too fondly felt like a scandal waiting to happen. So lovers did what anyone would do when words failed them. They found ways to escape. Not grand escapes, no galloping into the forest with a banner of rebellion. These were quiet escapes. Subtle, small acts of vanishing. A few minutes of shared air. A space no one else was watching. A moment that didn't need explanation. The most popular escape was the walk. A simple request, might we take air in the garden? Innocent on paper. But behind the ivy-covered walls, among the stone benches and fountains, these walks became sanctuaries. There, you could say just enough to feel brave, and not quite enough to get into trouble. Even if others accompanied you, a walk gave you space to be near each other. To talk about the weather while meaning something more. To offer your cloak when the wind picked up. To ask questions with your eyes that your voice couldn't afford to ask. Then there were the late returns. After an evening feast or a long day of duties, someone might linger. Pretend to have forgotten something. Return to the hall when no one else was there. And if they weren't alone, if the person they'd hoped to see just happened to be there, too, well, that was just coincidence, wasn't it? These moments were fragile. They often ended in almost confessions. A sentence that trailed off. A compliment offered just shy of too direct. I've noticed you're always kind to the servants. You seem happiest when you're near the stables. I enjoy these talks. They weren't declarations, but they were real. Because in a world of arranged pairings and forced formality, the chance to be honest, even a little, was rare. Some lovers created secret routines. Meeting by the same pillar each morning, under the pretense of checking the lighting. Offering the same flower at the start of the week. Visiting the hound pens at the same hour, just to see if the other person might be there, brushing mud off their boots and trying not to smile too soon. In these routines, affection lived. Soft, consistent, and mostly unspoken. And sometimes, silence said everything. Two people might sit beside each other, say nothing, and leave feeling more understood than after a dozen letters. Because being near someone, truly near, was a rare and sacred thing. Especially when the world demanded you keep your distance. Of course, not all escapes were successful. A locked door, a sudden interruption, a missed moment that made the next one feel heavier. But even those failures added to the story. The ache of almost. The breath that almost became a confession. The look that said, I wanted to say something, followed by, I know. Because not every love needed a beginning. Or an end. Some lived in the space between, unsure, unspoken, and unforgettable. So when the day ended, and the corridors emptied, and the castle settled into its nighttime hush, you could sometimes find them. Two people, far apart, staring out of opposite windows, wondering if the other was doing the same. And though they couldn't touch, or speak, or promise anything, they both felt it. And that was enough. In a medieval castle, love wasn't just about the heart, it was about reputation. And reputation, that was currency. Armor. A carefully stitched tapestry of who you were, what you were worth, and who whispered your name after supper. Every glance, every gesture, every step you took near someone else's chamber could be, and often was, interpreted, exaggerated, and repeated by a chorus of candle-bearing commentators. And so, falling in love wasn't just risky. It was news. Unlike today, where gossip can be passed through whispers or screens, castle gossip moved on foot, dressed in servant robes or noble gowns, traveling from hearth to hall, from kitchen to corridor. And it traveled fast. A nobleman who spent a little too much time in the garden might become the subject of hushed speculation. Was he simply admiring the roses? Or waiting to bump into the lady who always happened to be trimming herbs when he walked by? A noble woman who laughed too freely at another's jest? Suspicious. Especially if she laughed again the next day. By the third chuckle, there were at least 4 separate versions of the story circulating between the seamstresses, the guards, and the elderly woman who polished the candlesticks and somehow knew everything. That's how powerful reputation was. You didn't have to confess your feelings. You didn't even have to act on them. The suggestion of interest could be enough to elevate or unravel you. For those already high on the social ladder, a flirtation could strengthen alliances or open doors. But for anyone below them, a single rumor could send everything crashing down. That's why so many romances stayed hidden, not just because of propriety, but because a name tied to the wrong name could cost you invitations, dowries, and the subtle respect that oiled the gears of court life. Still, gossip wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it was. Hopeful. The castle had a way of rooting for romance, quietly, of course, with soft nudges. A seating arrangement that placed two people side by side. A task assigned that involved shared space and low-stakes conversation. A servant lingering longer than needed so that two people could have a moment without technically being alone. But even when the whispers were kind, they were still dangerous. Because affection that bloomed too publicly became a performance, and once the court turned its eyes on you, every breath had meaning. Two people talking near a window. They're clearly in love. Two people not talking near a window. Something must have happened. One person walking alone in the corridor where they usually walk together. It's over. And if one of them was seen talking to someone else, well, prepare for heartbreak set to harp music. There were even castle matchmakers, unofficial, of course, who took it upon themselves to predict outcomes and push things along. These were the ones who whispered suggestions into the ears of bored nobles, handed off handkerchiefs accidentally, and claimed to have seen smiles that may or may not have existed. But here's the curious part. Despite the weight of it all, the eyes, the pressure, the politics, people still fell in love. Openly, foolishly, and gloriously. And when two people dared to show it, even just a little, they often found themselves in the center of a very delicate game. One where each interaction had to be weighed. Each word chosen. Each touch avoided or delayed. Because if they moved too fast, the court might turn cold. If they moved too slowly, someone else might step in. And if they misread the room entirely, their story could be rewritten by others before it even had a chance to begin. So they danced, verbally, emotionally, socially. A waltz of reputation and reality. A courtship shaped not just by the two people in it, but by the many who surrounded them. Because in the castle, love wore many masks. And sometimes the most important one was the one it showed the world. Imagine trying to fall in love in a house where someone is always watching. Not metaphorically, literally. Watching from the stairwell. Listening from behind the tapestries. Pretending to scrub a goblet while eavesdropping on your conversation near the bread table. That was life in a medieval castle. Grand, beautiful, and absolutely saturated with an audience. Privacy wasn't a luxury, it was a myth. And so, if you had feelings for someone, you had two options. One, keep those feelings under your cloak, speak only in metaphor, and pray your glance didn't linger too long. Or two, go public and prepare to have your entire romantic life narrated by a chorus of gossip-prone nobility and servants with excellent hearing. Some chose boldness. They made their intentions clear. These were the ones who gave public tokens, asked for dances in front of everyone, and said poems with their names proudly signed in dramatic ink. Admirable. Yes. But make no mistake, it came with consequences. Because once you stepped into the spotlight, everything became a performance. If you smiled at your beloved, it was analyzed. If they didn't smile back, it was a tragedy. If you were seen speaking to someone else, a new rumor was born before you even reached the corridor. Even small things became significant. A changed seat at supper. A skipped walk in the courtyard. A ribbon not worn. These were read like omens, interpreted with more intensity than any religious text. And the people reading them weren't just servants or fellow nobles, they were family. Parents. Siblings. Uncles who believed they were experts on courtship despite having been married off before they learned to write their own name. In that environment, some couples cracked under the pressure. What began as genuine affection twisted into performance, gestures done for show, compliments offered not for closeness, but for protection. Because if the court believed in your romance, it could be used as a tool. If the court doubted it, it could be used as a weapon. Others leaned into the chaos. They played the part of the love-struck noble, knowing full well how it would be discussed. They exchanged notes with elaborate seals and had them delivered by falcon, just for the spectacle. They composed songs so over the top that even the bard raised an eyebrow. And while the whispers swirled, they danced on, aware of every eye, and secretly amused by it all. But most people, most real people, just wanted something quiet. A romance that didn't need to be decoded or dissected. A moment of warmth that belonged to them, not to the court. And so they found ways to shrink the stage. They met early in the morning, when the castle was still heavy with sleep. They walked in the herb gardens, where the scent of rosemary masked conversation. They sat on opposite ends of a chapel pew and let silence say everything they couldn't. And they tried, desperately, to protect what they had from becoming someone else's entertainment. Because in a world where walls had ears and floors had opinions, love had to be careful. It had to be clever. And above all, it had to be honest, because when everything else was noise, honesty was the only thing that could cut through. Not honesty shouted, not declared in front of the feast, but whispered, held, shared with one person in one moment when no one else was watching. Or at least, no one that mattered. In a castle full of rules, rituals, and watching eyes, love often existed in the spaces between words. Not in the declarations, but in the pauses. The unsent letters. The moments that passed unspoken, but somehow still understood. Because sometimes, the most meaningful things were the ones that were never actually said. They lived in half smiles, in subtle glances across crowded halls, in the way two people always seemed to arrive at the chapel at the same time, then pretend it was a coincidence. They lingered in the question, will you be at the feast tonight? Asked casually, as if it didn't carry the weight of longing. The castle itself became part of the language. The places people stood. The corners they visited. The seats they chose. A single shift in behavior, a missed routine, a sudden silence, could mean everything. A hallway that once held brief hellos now felt too quiet. A gaze that once stayed a second too long now looked past you entirely. And still, no one said it. Sometimes they couldn't, because families were watching, futures were planned, promises had been made that had nothing to do with the heart, and sometimes they just didn't know how. What words do you use to describe something that feels both sacred and forbidden? How do you explain the ache of being near someone and still feeling the distance between you? So they kept going. They spoke about weather, about books, about the latest noble family arriving for supper. But underneath it all was a current of what wasn't said. I missed you. I hoped you'd come. I dreamed of the way your voice sounded last week when you laughed. And every so often, there was a slip. A soft moment when the wall cracked. Maybe they reached for something at the same time, and their hands touched just a beat too long. Maybe one of them said, this reminded me of you, while offering a ribbon or a dried sprig of mint. Maybe there was a lull in conversation, and one of them looked up and said, quietly, I wish things were different. Then the silence returned. The performance resumed. But for a heartbeat, something real had been there. And real was dangerous. Real meant risk. Real meant you might lose something. But it also meant you had something, even if only briefly. So they carried on, these almost lovers. They stayed in their roles, played their parts. And on rare nights, when the moonlight fell just right through the high castle windows, they allowed themselves to hope, just for a moment, that maybe, one day, they could speak plainly, see the things that lived in their hearts, without code, without caution, that maybe the world would change, or maybe they would. Until then, they held on to the silence, the shared looks, the things they never said, but meant anyway. Because in the castle, words were dangerous. But silence could be everything. We spend so much time dreaming about the first glance, the first dance, the first letter exchanged under torchlight. But what happened after all of that? After the whispers quieted, the court stopped watching, and the ribbon given in secret became a memory folded into a drawer. What happened after two people finally chose one another? The answer, as with all things medieval, is complicated. Because love stories didn't end when the dancing stopped. They kept going, in quieter rooms, over shared meals, in the little moments of life that weren't worthy of a bard's song but held just as much meaning. A noble couple, once united by whispered courtship and cautious affection, now faced the daily ritual of coexisting. And that meant learning new kinds of romance, smaller, softer, stranger. It meant knowing how they took their wine, how they liked their boots dried by the fire, whether they preferred the sound of birds in the morning or silence while reading. It meant watching someone remove their armor or unpin their braids and realizing that love wasn't in the performance anymore, it was in the presence. But this next chapter wasn't always easy. In some cases, the couple had barely known each other before they married. Their courtship had been brief, careful, and carefully supervised. Once the ink dried on the contract and the witnesses went home, the real work began. Some grew closer. They learned to speak each other's language, not the public one, filled with metaphors and compliments, but the real one. The one made of glances across the breakfast table. The one that said, I know you're tired, or I saved you the last honey cake. Others struggled. Because because sometimes, once the secrecy and spectacle faded, the truth stood plain between them. They were not, in fact, meant for each other. And no amount of tapestries or shared titles could change that. But even in those cases, something tender often remained. A quiet respect. A memory of how it once felt to stand in the garden and almost say something. A shared understanding that, even if love didn't last, the effort to reach for it had still mattered. And for those lucky few, for the couples who found something lasting amid the shifting alliances and candlelit politics, the years ahead held a different kind of courtship. One shaped by time. They learned the art of quiet support, of lifting each other up during feasts without speaking, of defending each other subtly in council chambers, of knowing when to let someone have the last word and when to speak for them if they couldn't. And sometimes they laughed about the old days, the chaperones, the letters that almost got intercepted, the time someone confused a love token with a napkin and nearly wiped their face with it at supper. Love, it turns out, is often best remembered with a smile. So what happened after the happily ever after? They lived. They argued. They supported each other. They faced winters and weddings and harvests. They held hands beneath the table. They spoke in sighs and unfinished thoughts. They fell asleep beside one another, night after night, and whispered things that never made it into the legends. And that was the real story. Not just how they fell in love, but how they stayed there. When the courtship was over and the vows were spoken, the quiet began. Not the silence of secrecy or stolen glances, but the gentle rhythm of daily life, shared, lived, and repeated under the same roof. And in that rhythm, love became something less poetic, but far more powerful. Because love in a medieval castle, once settled, looked a lot like routine. There were meals to attend, duties to manage, messages to respond to. And while the stories remembered the ballads and the battles, they often forgot the other moments, the smaller ones. Like watching someone braid their hair by candlelight. Like fetching a forgotten scarf from the corridor, just because you knew they'd need it. Like sitting beside someone at the evening meal and passing them the bread without being asked, because you knew they always forgot to take it. These were the new languages of affection. Practical, quiet, undramatic, but rich with meaning. Even in the world of nobles and knights, someone had to keep track of clean linens. Someone had to make sure the winter cloaks were properly mended. Someone had to know that the person they loved hated cinnamon but would never admit it aloud in front of the kitchen staff. This wasn't the love of secret notes and dramatic declarations. This was the love of everyday care. Of waking early so your partner could sleep a little longer. Of keeping their favorite page marked in a book, even if they never said thank you. Of offering a dry cloak when they came in from the rain, not as a grand gesture, but because they were cold, and you noticed. Sometimes, they still flirted. Not with poetry, but with subtle mischief. A sarcastic comment over morning tea. A playful nudge in the corridor. A glance across the room that said, "We made it." That said, "You're still the one I choose, even now, even here, with dust in our boots and ink stains on our fingers." They didn't need to say much anymore. So much had already been said in the quiet. There were still challenges, of course. Days when misunderstandings simmered, when duties pulled them apart, when words came out sharp instead of soft. But even then, love was there, in the apology bread left at a place setting. In the way one waited by the stairs at the end of a long day. In the shared sigh before sleep. The castle itself changed. Rooms once used for secret meetings became shared spaces. The quiet corners where they once hoped to brush hands became places to steal 5 minutes of peace before a meeting with the steward. Time had passed, but the feeling hadn't. Because love, once rooted in performance, had grown into presence, into shared experience, into remembering the little things, how they liked their tea, what made them laugh, which song made them stop and listen every time it played. No one sang songs about these things. There were no tapestries for them. No ballads, no poems, no stained glass windows. But maybe they didn't need those things. Because this love, this steady, daily, utterly unremarkable love, was the kind that actually lasted. And even in the shadow of stone towers and flickering torches, it shone quietly, softly, enough to warm a room. There's a kind of romance that sneaks up on you, not loud or dazzling, but slow and quiet and lasting. The kind that lives not in first kisses, but in second winters. Not in love letters, but in long silences shared over soup. Not in secrets, but in familiarity. In the later years years of love, things changed. The dramatic courtship was long past. The eyes that once darted across the great hall now looked more slowly, more softly. The hands that once trembled while passing a ribbon now steadied cups of tea, tight cloaks, smooth fraying fabric without needing to speak a word. And if they were lucky, if they endured the storms of expectation, the tug of duty, the politics of proximity, two people could grow old together in a castle built not just of stone, but of moments. The servants noticed it first. How one always remembered to leave space by the hearth for the other's stool. How they waited for each other to sit down before beginning a meal. How one of them still snuck extra biscuits onto the other's plate, even after all these years. It wasn't affection made for show. It wasn't grand or polished or poetic. It was love that had settled into the bones. Love that lived in shared blankets and slow walks in the garden. In knowing which tower had the best view of the morning sun. In finishing each other's sentences, not because they were trying to impress anyone, but because they'd heard them all before and still wanted to hear them again. Sometimes they didn't talk much at all. They didn't need to. A glance from across the courtyard said, "You've been working too long." A gentle nudge at the feast table said, "Don't forget to rest." And a slow smile during a story they both heard a dozen times said, "I remember it too." The castle itself seemed to remember. The halls they used to sneak through now echoed with their footsteps side by side. The chapel where they once exchanged glances during prayer was now where they sat hand in hand, content and quiet. There were challenges, of course. Aging brought its own trials. Stairs became harder. Chores stretched longer. Feasts became simpler, and dances fewer. But there was a comfort in having someone beside you who remembered every version of you, young and nervous, middle-aged and determined, older and just a little slower but no less sharp. And perhaps the most beautiful part, they never stopped noticing the small things. How one of them still arranged the blankets just so. How the other made sure the candle was lit before night truly settled. How, even on difficult days, they still saved the last piece of bread for the other. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present. And when they sat together by the fire at the end of a long day, legs wrapped in wool, the castle warm and quiet around them, they didn't need music or poetry or applause. They had a life, a rhythm, a story made of soft beginnings and even softer endings. Because in the end, the greatest love stories weren't always the ones with the loudest starts. Sometimes they were the ones that lasted through seasons, through changes, through silence. The ones that grew older, day by day, and never stopped choosing each other, even when the rest of the world had forgotten how it all began. It may surprise you to know that for all the romantic letters, stolen glances, and whispered vows exchanged under moonlight, the most nerve-wracking moment in any castle love story was not the confession. It was the wedding. Because a wedding in a medieval castle was not just a celebration, it was a production. Equal parts feast, negotiation, social theater, and mild chaos. If falling in love was poetry, a castle wedding was paperwork wrapped in roast duck and marzipan. To begin with, it wasn't always about the couple. It was about the families. Who was gaining land? Who was losing a title? Who had the better tapestries to display in the hall? Behind every sweet smile and ceremonial blessing, there was usually a scribe keeping notes on inheritance lines. Still, there was magic in it. If the couple actually liked each other, a rare but welcome bonus, the wedding became something more than just political convenience. It became a promise made in front of everyone they'd once hidden from. But oh, the logistics. There were dresses to be embroidered, sometimes taking weeks of careful stitching. Every thread a declaration of wealth, patience, and the questionable taste of the noblewoman's distant cousin who insisted on adding gold swans to the sleeves. There were menus to be debated. Venison or pheasant, fish or goose. Would there be enough honey cakes? What if someone spilled wine on the ceremonial rug again, like they did at the last event? Then came the guest list, a puzzle worthy of royal strategists. Which noble houses to invite, which ones to snub, and how to seat everyone in a way that avoided at least 3 feuds and a potential soup spoon incident. And of course, music. A bard was required. Preferably one who knew the couple's story well enough to write a flattering tune, but not so well that they included any questionable details from the courtship. It was a delicate balance. But behind all the planning, behind the elaborate meals and carefully timed candle lighting, something tender lived. The moment when the bride stepped into the hall and caught sight of the person waiting. The small breath they shared before the vows. The brief, fleeting touch touch of hands beneath layers of silken expectation, and perhaps a quiet exchange of smiles that said, "We made it." The ceremony itself could vary. In some castles, it was a grand event held in the Great Hall, with tapestries freshly scrubbed and chandeliers dripping with greenery. In others, it was simpler, a blessing in the chapel, followed by a modest meal and 1,000 approving glances. But no matter the size, it was always observed, always whispered about, because weddings in the castle were more than just unions. They were beginnings, statements, sometimes even scandals. And when the guests finally left, the candles burned low and the feast was over. The real story began. Because beyond the ceremony was life. And whether the marriage had been arranged or chosen, quiet or dramatic, the couple now stood at the threshold of something new. A shared story that would unfold over days, years, and seasons. No longer in secret, no longer beneath the gaze of chaperones or beside chapel pillars, but together, out loud, and at last, with the doors open. After the vows were spoken and the ceremonial ribbons tied, the wedding may have been complete, but the performance had only just begun. Because in a medieval castle, the wedding wasn't just a moment, it was an event. And like any good event, it required a proper finale. Enter the wedding feast, equal parts joyful celebration and social chess match. The great hall would be transformed. Tapestries would be aired. Candles would be lit until the whole room flickered like a living constellation. And at the center of it all, the newlyweds would sit side by side on what was often the most uncomfortable bench in the castle, while everyone they'd ever known watched them chew. The food, of course, was lavish. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, honey-glazed fruits, spiced wine, and enough bread to start a small village. Each course was a message. Look how well connected this union is. Look how wealthy this family has become. Please notice the stuffed goose. We had to borrow it from a neighboring estate. The couple was expected to smile, to nod politely, to be gracious when the bard sang a slightly exaggerated version of how they met, especially when he added a fictional dragon rescue that definitely didn't happen. There were toasts, speeches, a surprising number of people reciting poems they wrote specifically for the occasion, some charming, others deeply confusing. But even amid the spectacle, there were moments that felt real. Like when the couple leaned in to share a whispered joke no one else could hear. When they both reached for the same cup and decided, wordlessly, to share it. When someone dropped a pie and they both laughed because it was the first moment all day that felt unplanned. And then came the first night, an occasion surrounded by so much expectation it practically had its own legend. In noble circles, the first night wasn't just private. In some cases, it wasn't private enough. There were witnesses, rituals, customs meant to verify, celebrate, or, in less romantic terms, document the start of the union. Thankfully, most couples managed to navigate these traditions with as much dignity as the circumstances allowed. But once the doors finally closed, really closed, and the guests faded away, the couple was alone. And for many, that was the first true moment of stillness. They removed their ceremonial clothing, their titles, their carefully arranged expressions. They looked at each other, not as noble heirs or symbols of family alliances, but as two people who had just agreed to share a life. Sometimes, that moment was tender, awkward, quiet. A soft exchange of hands, a nervous laugh, a shy promise that tomorrow they'd figure out how to begin. Other times, it was comforting, familiar. The final puzzle piece falling into place after years of quiet affection and cautious hope. And sometimes, though not always, it was just the beginning of a long, slow unraveling of everything they thought marriage would be. Because love, after a wedding, changed. It became less about ceremony and more about showing up. Less about gestures and more about habits. And that first night, for all its candlelight and tradition, was simply the first of many where two people would learn how to rest in the same silence. So as the castle settled into sleep, as the last of the wine was cleared away and the fire burned low in the hearth, something new was just beginning. Not a song, not a story, not a performance. Just a quiet life. Cheered. The morning after a castle wedding didn't begin with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It began with sunlight creeping through heavy curtains, the soft clatter of servants waking the halls, and the distant hum of a world returning to its usual rhythm. For the newlyweds, it was the first day of something both ordinary and entirely new. Gone were the guests, the music, the feast, What remained was a room, a shared bed, and the quiet awareness that everything had changed, while, somehow, everything stayed exactly the same. There were expectations, of course. In noble households, the couple was often expected to appear at breakfast together. Not late, not too early, just early enough to seem respectable. Their seating was deliberate, their expressions examined. Even their posture was considered a statement. Were they smiling? Polite? Did they seem comfortable? In truth, they were usually tired, a little overwhelmed, and still adjusting to the strange reality of no longer being two separate stories. And so began the real marriage. It wasn't about banquets anymore. It was about scheduling, compromise, learning when the other liked to bathe, whether they preferred oat cakes or bread in the morning, whether they needed silence after a difficult council meeting or simply someone to hand them tea without asking questions. There was no guidebook, no bard's tale to explain how to live together when the castle quieted. The first week brought surprises. One might discover their new partner snored, or paced at night, or insisted on reciting weather forecasts from memory. Some discoveries were sweet, like the way they folded their clothes with care or left small sprigs of lavender in their pillowcase. Other discoveries were less poetic, like realizing they used far too much salt, or that their favorite tunic was a dreadful color and no one had been brave enough to say so until now. And still, they learned. They learned how to move around each other, how to argue without raising voices, how to apologize without always needing words. They learned that love, now, meant remembering to bring a second cloak when the weather turned, that it meant pausing before replying, that it meant showing up to meals they'd rather skip. And eventually, people stopped watching. The whispers moved on to other couples, other stories, other glances across the hall. The pressure faded, and in its place came a new kind of quiet, a shared one. A silence made not of awkwardness, but of understanding. They grew into each other's rhythms. Some mornings, they rose together. Other mornings, one would sleep while the other lit the hearth. They learned that being a pair didn't mean being identical. It meant adjusting, stretching, making space where it hadn't existed before. Some days were difficult. The world beyond the walls still intruded, conflicts, politics, family demands. But even then, there were moments of refuge. A glance from across the room that meant I'm still here. A small squeeze of the hand that meant we'll get through it. Love, in these days, became a practice. It wasn't always romantic. Sometimes it looked like listening. Sometimes it looked like leaving someone alone. But it was there, in the way they touched each other's shoulders while passing in a narrow hall. In the way they remembered each other's favorite stories. In the way they stayed. The morning after may have begun in uncertainty. But the days that followed, those were where the real love lived. In the quiet, in the learning, in the choosing, again and again, to face the day side by side. Not as a performance, but as a promise. Some love stories are sung by bards and carved into the walls of chapels. Others, they stay hidden, not because they weren't real, but because they were too real, too fragile, too forbidden, too fleeting to survive in the open air of court life. These were the secret loves that never made it to the great hall. The ones that lived only in the quiet spaces, the spaces between prayers, behind columns, in rooms where no one else dared to look. And more often than not, they started in the chapel. The castle chapel wasn't just for worship. It was for whispers, for reflection, for the kind of silence that carried more truth than most conversations. Two people might enter for different reasons, one to pray, one to hide from their responsibilities, and find themselves kneeling side by side, saying nothing, yet suddenly feeling seen. It wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it began with shared glances during morning devotions. Sometimes it was the way someone gently returned a dropped candle holder and paused just long enough to say, "You're not alone." They didn't mean to fall for each other. But something about the chapel, the low light, the hush, the sense that the outside world didn't quite reach this far, made space for emotions that weren't allowed elsewhere. And once a connection sparked in a place like that, it was hard to ignore. Of course, they couldn't act on it. Not really. Maybe one was a priest. Maybe the other was promised to someone else. Maybe their roles, their names, or their bloodlines meant that even a single letter exchange between them could lead to consequences neither wanted to face. So they didn't write. They didn't speak often. They simply returned, day after day, not together, never together. Look close enough, always near enough to notice if the other was late, if the other looked tired, if the other's hands trembled slightly when clasped in prayer. And slowly, their lives became shaped by those small encounters. A glance that meant I'm here. A soft exhale that meant I wish things were different. A bowed head that held more longing than an entire poem. Others noticed, briefly. A curious maid. A young knight. A servant who raised an eyebrow and chose not to say anything. The court was full of watchers, but even watchers had their limits. Not every secret wanted to be found. And sometimes, the best way to keep a love safe was to make it seem entirely ordinary. Still, there were risks. A comment overheard. A schedule questioned. A moment that lingered too long. So they stayed careful. And though they never kissed, never confessed, never danced in the Great Hall or exchanged tokens, they loved. In quiet, in restraint, in every choice they made not to speak. And that, in its own way, was a deeper kind of love. One that wasn't built on the expectation of more. One that didn't demand to be fulfilled. It simply was. A truth that lived between them, held carefully like a flame. Never fanned, never extinguished. Just there, flickering in the chapel while the rest of the world prayed for things far less sacred. Some love stories were recorded in ink, signed by lords, sealed with wax, sung by bards. And others vanished. Not because they weren't important, but because they were too delicate to survive the weight of official memory. These were the lovers who never made it into family trees. The ones whose names were whispered, not written. Whose meetings were not arranged by families, but stumbled upon by fate. And whose endings, if they had endings, happened far away from parchment and prayer books. Their stories lived on in fragments. A note never delivered. A room no one entered after they left. A pair of shoes found near the gate the morning after a storm. In castle records, they were listed only by absence. Left in the night, assigned to another estate, transferred without notice. But those who knew, really knew, understood that these weren't ordinary departures. These were escapes. Quiet flights from a world that wouldn't allow what their hearts had already decided. Sometimes they were servants. Two stable hands who spent too many hours brushing the same horse. A cook and a guard who met on bread runs and slowly began leaving extra sweets tucked into the other's satchel. No one arranged their match. No one celebrated it. But they knew what they had, and when the world pressed in too tightly, they chose to disappear together. Other times, it was a noble and a commoner. Those stories were even more fragile. A relationship that could unravel an entire reputation if discovered. So they met in shadows, in stairwells, in forest clearings beyond the castle walls. Every meeting a risk. Every word a thread they had to hold on to without fraying. And then, one day, they were gone. Sometimes the escape was planned. A shared glance across the courtyard that meant, tonight. A bundle of clothes hidden near the garden wall. A map drawn carefully from memory, passed like a prayer. Other times, it was sudden. A message slipped beneath a door, come now. No time. And just like that, they vanished. The castle adjusted. Rooms were reassigned. Chores rebalanced. Their absence explained with shrugs and vague phrases. They were needed elsewhere. Family called. Illness, perhaps. But for those who had seen them together, who had noticed the quiet love blooming in corners of the castle no one else looked, their disappearance wasn't a mystery. It was an ending. Or maybe a beginning. Just not the kind written in scrolls. And though their names were lost, their story lingered. In the way certain rooms felt quieter than they should. In the way a servant folded a blanket just so, the way one of the missing lovers used to. In the way someone paused by the stables at dusk, remembering the sound of two voices laughing in the hayloft. These lovers didn't leave legacies in bloodlines or property, but they left something else. A memory of what it looked like when two people chose love over expectation. When they chose freedom. And in a place where most stories were written by power, that choice, quiet and unrecorded, was a revolution all its own. Not every love story ends with a union. Some end in silence. Not in the dramatic silence of scandal or heartbreak, but the soft, lingering kind, the kind that stays behind when one person goes and the other remains, still waiting by the window. Because in every castle, there were those who stayed. They were the ones who loved quietly and let go even quieter. The ones who watched someone walk away, into duty, into marriage, into the arms of someone chosen by family, and said nothing. Not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much to make it harder. Their story was not one of running away together or whispering promises under a full moon. Their story was the ache that settled in the space where a name used to be. Maybe they were a lady in waiting who fell for a noble already promised. Maybe they were a page who once brushed fingers with someone far above their station. Maybe they were just two people who, for one fleeting season, found a rhythm, before the world reminded them it wasn't allowed. They never kissed. They never confessed. But they remembered. They remembered the morning walks through the herb garden where they pretend not to notice one another. They remembered the way their hands had passed the same object just a little too slowly. They remembered the conversations filled with everything but what they truly meant. And when the other was gone, when the wedding bells rang or the new post was announced, they didn't cry in front of anyone. Instead, they lit candles in the chapel. They walked a long corridor alone. They stood at the ramparts during sunset, not looking for anyone, but remembering how it once felt to hope they might appear. And slowly, they made peace with the stillness. They learned to carry their love like a relic, not loud, not heavy, but sacred. Something not meant to be touched anymore, but still worthy of a quiet moment each morning. A name spoken once in thought, and then folded away again. Over time, others forgot. New love stories filled the castle. New rumors. New glances. But the ones who stayed behind still remembered. Not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Gratitude for having loved it all. Because even if it didn't last, even if it never became more than a collection of small, stolen moments, it had been real. And that was enough. They still served. Still worked, still danced at feasts and laughed in gardens. But there was a part of them that always stood just a bit apart. Not lonely, just quiet. And in that quiet, they found strength. Because to love in silence, to choose peace over pleading, to let someone go without asking them to stay, that was a love story too. One that no bard sang about, one that no portrait captured. But a story, all the same. And in the soft hush of castle halls at night, if you listen closely, you might still feel it. That steady, echoing memory of someone who once stayed, and loved in the spaces no one else could see. Tucked between the pages of old castle ledgers and beneath the floorboards of forgotten chambers, there existed a different kind of history. Not the kind recorded by scribes or sung by minstrels, but the kind written in shaky handwriting, sealed in wax, and never sent. Love letters. Some delivered, some hidden. Some still waiting in places no one visits anymore. In a medieval world where speech was guarded and glances were currency, the written word became something precious. A parchment held more than ink, it held confession, risk, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the person it was meant for would read it and feel the same. And so, people wrote. They wrote late at night, by flickering candlelight, hearts racing as they struggled to say aloud what they could only say on paper. They wrote in the margins of prayer books, on the backs of borrowed poems, on scraps of fabric when paper was too scarce and secrecy too important. Some letters were never signed. Some were signed with initials only known to two people. Others were left blank entirely, as if the absence of a name could protect the writer from the weight of what they dared to say. I saw you today by the western tower. You did not see me. That was enough. You looked tired. I wanted to bring you honey, but it would have been noticed. So I left it near the fountain. I hope you found it. I think of you when the wind blows through the reeds by the chapel. I don't know why. I just do. Simple words, but words soaked with longing. Of course, delivering these letters was another matter entirely. In noble courts, there were entire systems for passing secret messages. A trusted maid, a sympathetic squire, a note hidden inside a fresh loaf of bread. These messengers became silent witnesses to 100 quiet romances. They asked no questions. They simply delivered hope. But sometimes, the letter never reached its destination. Maybe the maid was dismissed. Maybe the note fell between the floorboards. Maybe it was tucked into a cloak and forgotten during the rush of morning duties. And so it remained undelivered, a sealed secret. Centuries later, some of these unsent letters have been found, faded and brittle, tucked between old beams or pressed into the lining of storage chests. Most had no names, but the sentiment, still clear. And while no one can say who wrote them, you can feel it, that weight of emotion wrapped in quiet restraint. A love that never asked for reply, only release. Sometimes the letters were delivered, but the recipient never replied. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear, out of confusion, out of timing. Because even when two hearts beat toward one another, the world around them didn't always make space for it. A noble woman already promised, a young monk afraid of what it meant, a knight torn between affection and allegiance. Love was rarely convenient. So the letter would be read, cherished, and tucked away. Sometimes pressed beneath a pillow. Sometimes burned to protect the secret. Sometimes hidden in a shoe, where it would remain close, even if unread again. And yet, writing the letter still mattered. Because even if no one ever saw it, even if the words never left the candlelit desk, it was proof that the feeling had existed. That for one moment, someone had dared to name their affection. To say, I see you. To say, you matter to me. And that alone changed something. Not everything. Not enough to rewrite the rules or shift the stars. But enough to soften a hard day. Enough to keep someone warm in the cold stillness of the night. There were even letters written long after the story had ended. A woman who, 10 years into marriage, wrote a letter to the boy she once knew, folded it, sealed it, and placed it inside a box she never opened again. A knight who wrote to a lost love every winter on the same day, though he never mailed a single one. They were letters for no one, and yet entirely for themselves. Not every love letter needed a reply. Some were simply a way to say goodbye, or to say what couldn't be said when it mattered most. Some were left at graves, others tucked behind loose stones in chapel walls, and others still scattered in rivers as offerings to the silence. And if you ever find one, cracked with age, edges softened by time, you may not recognize the names or understand the context, but you'll feel it. The weight of unsaid things, the ache of a thought held too long, the tenderness of someone who once dared to write. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to say it anyway. And in a castle full of history, war, and duty, that quiet, trembling honesty was sometimes the most powerful thing of all. Before emojis, before text messages, before love letters slipped through doors in the middle of the night, there was a far older system of communication. One stitched together by instincts, seasons, and deeply unspoken rules. In the medieval world, if you couldn't say it with words, you showed it. Sometimes with a flower, sometimes with firewood, sometimes with the precise way you folded someone's cloak at the edge of their bed. This was the language of gestures, and in castles where feelings had to be cloaked in custom and courtly distance, it was the most honest language lovers had. Start with flowers. Each one carried meaning. A sprig of rosemary meant remembrance. Thyme meant courage. Lavender offered quiet devotion. Giving someone a bundle of herbs could be interpreted in a dozen different ways depending on the setting, the colors, and even the time of day it was delivered. A rose left in a chapel pew might say, I miss you. A daisy placed in the folds of a laundry bundle might mean I'm thinking of you, still. And if someone tucked a violet into your traveling cloak before a long journey, that was the castle's version of come back safely, and don't forget what we never said. Flowers wilted, but the memory of who gave them and what they meant lasted much longer. Then there were gestures with fire. Yes, literal firewood. If someone noticed that your hearth was always cold and started leaving bundles of kindling near your chamber, that was care. If they made sure your fire was lit before you returned from your duties and never mentioned it, that was affection without fanfare. Some even learned to recognize the type of firewood: oak for strength, birch for renewal, hazel for wisdom. Whether or not those meanings were entirely intentional, people believed in them. And belief, as always, had power. Another favorite signal: laundry. Yes, laundry. Folding patterns weren't just for neatness. They were often deliberate. A cloak folded with the edges inward meant privacy. One folded outward, with the inner lining showing, could mean openness. A handkerchief folded once and left at someone's bedside might say you were on my mind. Folded twice and tied with string, that was practically a proposal. Even the placement of clean linens carried meaning. A fresh cloth laid across the foot of your bed, scented with a familiar herb, meant someone was paying attention. It was subtle, but it was seen. Then there was food. bread crust left uncut could be a joke. I know you hate them, but I forgot. Cut precisely and arranged in a small dish meant I remembered. Sharing fruit was an intimate act. Sharing fruit without being asked was a declaration. There were even stories of couples exchanging entire meals without speaking. One person would cook, the other would clean. The language of care passed back and forth like a whispered lullaby. Not everything was soft. Sometimes the gestures were sharp, protective. A guard who always posted near your quarters, even if it wasn't their assigned watch. A friend who diverted conversations away from your name. Someone who offered their seat not because it was proper, but because they saw the wariness in your eyes and knew you needed rest. Love in a castle wasn't about grand scenes. It was about notice. Noticing when someone's boots were worn. Noticing when they hadn't eaten. Noticing the look on their face when a certain song played, and finding a way to ask about it without asking at all. It was about small tasks done with quiet precision. The way someone straightened your plate before a feast. The way they plucked a bit of lint from your sleeve before you entered a room full of nobles. The way they let you in at chess. But only sometimes. These things didn't have a formal name. There were no scrolls to explain them. But those who paid attention knew what was happening. Because in the absence of spoken affection, these quiet acts became the proof. Of friendship. Of tenderness. Of love, carefully built in a world that rarely allowed it to grow wild. And the most beautiful part, you didn't need to be royalty to receive them. Servants did it too. Stable hands, cooks, scribes, a nod here, a warm bowl placed gently in your hands on a cold morning, a cloak repaired without comment. These were the ways love moved through stone walls, soft, invisible, and unshakably real. Not everyone noticed, but those who did, remembered. And sometimes, years later, long after the castle had changed and the names had faded, someone might find themselves doing the same gestures, folding cloth a certain way, stirring herbs into soup, lighting fires before someone comes home, and not know why. Only that once, someone had done it for them. And it had mattered. Not every castle story ended with a kiss beneath the stars or a life shared beside the hearth. Some ended with a glance. A single look across a crowded hall, across a battlefield, across the divide that centuries of duty had carved between two people who once believed they might find a way. Some love stories didn't break. They dissolved. Quietly. Slowly. Like mist after rain. In the medieval world, parting wasn't always dramatic. It was often inevitable. One was called away, by family, by war, by a marriage arranged years before either of them ever met. The other was left behind. Not because they weren't loved, but because love was rarely enough to hold back the tides of tradition and obligation. Sometimes they had days to prepare, sometimes only hours, and sometimes just a moment. That moment was everything. It happened in the corner of a feast hall, when one stood to leave and the other stayed seated, unable to move. It happened outside the chapel, with only a glance, a slight nod, and the hush of unsaid things filling the space between them. They didn't embrace. That would have drawn attention. They didn't cry. There wasn't time. Instead, their eyes said what centuries of language couldn't. I would have stayed, if I could. I will think of you every spring. I hope someone, someday, sees you the way I did. That last glance wasn't just goodbye. It was memory made visible. It was a promise, wordless and heartbreaking, you will live in me, even after you're gone. Sometimes, they left willingly. A knight bound by oath. A lady choosing duty over dreams. A squire taking a post in another lord's service, knowing full well what they were leaving behind. Other times, departure came as a surprise. A letter arrived. A summons. A decision made by someone else, far above them both. The moment to speak never arrived. And then, they were gone. The one left behind felt it differently. They carried the last look like a stone in their pocket, always there, quiet but heavy. They moved through the castle corridors with half their attention still in that moment. They stood at windows, not searching, just remembering. And yet, life continued. Feasts were held. Chores were done. Robes were folded. The sun still rose behind the tower, casting long shadows across rooms that once held whispers. But for the one who remained, everything felt a little too quiet. The hall echoed differently. The garden seemed too still. and every so often they turned their head too quickly, thinking they saw a familiar shape in the distance. They never spoke of it, not aloud. Not because they weren't brave, but because that look, that final glance, had said everything that needed to be said. Speaking now would only unweave the spell of it. And so, they honored it in silence. They lit a candle every morning, not in mourning, but in memory. They avoided the path where they once walked together, until one day, they didn't. They folded their own cloak a little more neatly, knowing once someone else had done it for them. And on certain days, rainy ones, or those first bright mornings in spring, they allowed themselves to feel it all over again. Just for a moment. Just enough to remember the warmth, not just the ache. Not every story ends in reunion. Some end in endurance. In learning how to live with love that was real, but brief. Powerful, but out of reach. And in castles, where lives were shaped by oaths, bloodlines, and quiet sacrifices, this was more common than most would admit. Two people meet. They feel something rare. They never say it aloud. One leaves. The other stays. The world forgets. But they don't. That's why, even now, in the ruins of old halls and beneath the faded paintings of noble houses long gone, you might still feel something. A presence. A memory. Two ghosts, not haunting. Just remembering. Not bound by unfinished business, but by a promise made in silence. I will carry your name quietly. I will remember the way you looked at me when the world shifted. Because even when castles fall, and stories fade, and letters are lost to dust and time, that one last glance, honest, fleeting, and unbearably human, remains. The kind of love that didn't need more pages. Just one moment. And someone to remember it. And so, dear listener, we leave the candlelit halls and quiet corners of the past behind. The stories you've heard tonight weren't about battles or kings. They were about glances held too long, letters never sent, and love folded carefully into the rhythm of ordinary days. In the silence between footsteps and the space between duties, people found connection, even if only for a moment. Not every romance in the medieval world made it into the songs. Most were quiet, most were soft, but all of them mattered. As you drift into sleep, may you carry these stories with you, not as history, but as reminders. That even in times of rules and restrictions, love found its way. Through flowers, through firewood, through folded bedsheets and final glances. You've been listening to Lore FM, where the past is never really gone, it just waits for someone to notice. Rest well, dream deeper, and when the castle doors close behind you, remember, some of the most powerful stories are the ones we tell in a whisper. Good night.